DeAndre Hopkins is a free agent, and the Falcons do need a wide receiver. But if you're a true NFL fan, you don't want to see him land in Atlanta.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, the podcast family, your team every day. And we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Make sure you follow in their footsteps, follow their blueprint for success by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today's episode, we will be joined later by Andrew Lyon of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast to talk about the Falcons' 7th round offensive line selection in Jovaughn Gwyn to wrap up our sort of ongoing series talking with the various Locked On college hosts about each of the Falcons' 6 draft picks. And so that will be in store at the end of today's episode. But first, we'll talk all about the Falcons' wide receiver need and talking all about DeAndre Hopkins. Now, this is not the first time on Locked On Falcons that we have talked about DeAndre Hopkins as a possible Atlanta Falcons target. We talked about it 2 months ago back in mid-March when trade rumors that clearly did not go anywhere first surfaced that connected the Falcons to DeAndre Hopkins. And now, we're here at the end of May or potentially the beginning of June. If you're, one of these knuckleheads that does not make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. But clearly the trade has not happened and certainly is not going to happen because officially on Tuesday, DeAndre Hopkins was released by the Arizona Cardinals. Now, it was officially announced, or it was initially announced back on Friday that the Cardinals were releasing DeAndre Hopkins, but because of the Memorial Day weekend and the fact that the Cardinals did not officially process that transaction on Friday, it did not become official until Tuesday afternoon. And, of course, over the weekend, there was like a slim possibility that maybe some team would be able to, sweeten the pot and give the Cardinals what they were looking for via trade offer. But obviously that did not happen. But, we'll start off talking about DeAndre Hopkins. And now the possibility is that DeAndre Hopkins could sign with the Atlanta Falcons if that was the place that he so choose. But I sit here with my spicy take of the day. I got to have one each on every episode that is your first listen, is that I think if you're a true fan of the NFL, you don't really want DeAndre Hopkins to the Atlanta Falcons. Like, clearly, there will be benefits to DeAndre Hopkins landing here in Atlanta. But we'll talk about those later. But I don't think you really, if you just want, you believe in utilitarian philosophy and what does the most good for the world, DeAndre Hopkins in an Atlanta Falcons uniform is not that, right? And it doesn't sound like DeAndre Hopkins is particularly interested in being an Atlanta Falcon. He was on a podcast not too long ago with Brandon Marshall, and he was asked the question, like, which 5 quarterbacks would you like to catch passes from? And he rattled off a bunch of names, and Desmond Ridder was not on that list. Maybe if he had expanded it to 6, maybe we would have gotten there. But based off of who he named, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, doesn't sound like Desmond Ridder is high on this list. And while, we here on Locked On Falcons are big fans of Desmond Ridder, I don't think it's going to be probably at least a year or two before he gets into that conversation with some of those guys, if you're being very optimistic about that. And, clearly by those names, all of those are top 5, top 10 quarterbacks. Most of those teams that we mentioned are teams that are expected to be in Super Bowl contention. And, it's DeAndre Hopkins towards the end of his career in his quote unquote ring chasing phase of his career. And I bring that up just because I've talked with Falcon fans over the last several months, and we've talked about the Falcons need a wide receiver position. And, occasionally someone will bring up the idea of, hey, why not bring back Julio Jones to Atlanta, given the Falcons needed the position and, wanting him to come back home. But then you always have these fans that say, well, he's ring chasing. And they say it with such disdain. And it's just funny to me because, like, you would only have to be a fan of a specific team, in this case, not talking about the quote unquote true NFL fans that, love all the teams and maybe just love one team in particular more than the others. But you would have to be only a fan would look at disdain for a professional football player that is trying to seek the highest pinnacle of achievement in the team sport, which is winning a Super Bowl, as something that is, they spit when they say it or something like that, So it's just funny when I heard that in reference to Julio Jones, quote unquote, ring chasing from a couple of fans, that they said it with disdain. And I imagine some of those fans are looking at DeAndre Hopkins and his short list of quarterbacks is like, oh, he's ring chasing. We don't want him here or something like that. So I think if you're a true football fan, what does the most good for the world is DeAndre Hopkins playing for one of these AFC teams. I'm a little biased here, but I personally think Buffalo would be a great landing spot for him, so that we can just get incredible games in the month of January, so that Buffalo and Cincinnati and Kansas City can pull off this arms race. Stephon Diggs and DeAndre Hopkins with Josh Allen, going up against Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins in Cincinnati, and then, going up against Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes and whoever, or the Chiefs receiver Sky Moore, I guess. We found out last year that it doesn't really matter who Patrick Mahomes is throwing to. It's still going to be just fine. But that to me does the most good for the world. And so we can have these games in January. Obviously, we hope that the Falcons are also playing meaningful games in January. But, what does the most good is us being able to sit down on those Saturdays and Sundays in the month of January, watching DeAndre Hopkins playing for one of these teams that are in the AFC, that are, competing for the highest levels, and seeing DeAndre Hopkins get that chance to chase that ring and get that ring after several years of, playing for mediocre football teams like the Houston Texans and Arizona Cardinals. No offense to those fan bases, but certainly none of those teams, were really serious Super Bowl contenders. Like, I'm sure, a couple of years ago, people were like, oh, the Cardinals could do something. And then, Kyler Murray in that Rams playoff game, but we'll leave that aside. But, we'll talk a little bit more about DeAndre Hopkins being a significant addition to the Falcons. We'll talk about how he could help the Atlanta Falcons, but, I think you guys should probably stop fantasizing about it. Although, we don't kink shame here on Locked On Falcons, your first listen. You can fantasize about whatever you want to fantasize about, and that includes DeAndre Hopkins in a Falcons uniform. Do your best. But I just think, that dream is probably not going to happen. So why set yourself up for disappointment? Although there is a dream for the Falcons to add another wide receiver. I'm talking about, Corey Davis watch, because it's notable to me that the Jets are a team that are reportedly interested in DeAndre Hopkins, and that just only adds fuel to the fire. And that's what we'll focus on as we continue today's episode, talking about, when is Corey Davis going to become free so that he can join the Atlanta Falcons. But we'll revisit some of those pros and cons of what, this Falcons offense could look like with DeAndre Hopkins in the fold. So we will indulge in your fantasies to continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about the delicious snack that is so good that you won't believe it's healthy for you, but it is, as of course, Built Bar, the protein bar. It tastes like a candy bar, and that's because Built Bars are covered in 100% real dark chocolate. They're low in sugar, they're low in calories, but they're high in protein with a whopping 17 grams of protein. They come in a variety of flavors. I myself just ordered myself a box of their limited time flavor, which is the Red Velvet Puff. It just came in the mail today. It's delicious. So head on over to built.com, find your particular flavor, use the promo code LOCKEDON15. You'll get 15% off your order, or you can head to Sam's Club or Walmart to get yourself a box of Built Bars. Go to the pharmacy section in Walmart. You'll get a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. If you're at Sam's, you can run in and grab a 13-bar box of brownie batter puff or churro. Check out Built Bar. You will thank me later. So continuing today's episode, we talked last about what DeAndre Hopkins could do in Atlanta, I think on the March 23rd episode of the podcast. So go check that out. But just to kind of rehash and revisit some of the talking points we had in that episode, talking about the pros and cons of the Falcons then making a DeAndre Hopkins trade. So now potentially, pursuing DeAndre Hopkins as a free agent now that he is officially that, the pros of DeAndre Hopkins are pretty obvious. You're going to add a very good wide receiver that's going to do potentially wonders for your young quarterback. We've seen over the years how, having that, big time receiver has been able to elevate, many a young quarterback to the next level. And while, DeAndre Hopkins is not the elite receiver that he once was, arguably the best receiver, or, potentially a Hall of Fame caliber receiver that was in the top 3 to 5 receivers consistently for most of the last decade. When people rank those receivers, he's still a pretty good receiver. If you go back and look at his last 17 games, that was something I touched upon on a previous episode, where like he was putting up numbers comparable to what you would consider to be a top 10, top 15 receiver in the same mold as Devontae Smith or DK Metcalf. So clearly he can do a lot of wonders for your offense. And while we are hopeful that Drake London will also be one of these top 10, top 15 type of receivers in that same tier, and I think he certainly has the capability of being that, he's not quite that dude yet. But as they say, having 2 of those guys, should Drake London develop into that, and you can still get that type of performance out of DeAndre Hopkins for the next couple of years, is better than having 1 of those guys. And I, on that previous episode, I talked about how it would be reminiscent of, having a trio of weapons with London, with Hopkins, with Pitts, comparable to what the Falcons had in 2012 when Matt Ryan had his true breakout year with weapons like Julio and Roddy and Tony Gonzalez. And of course, we're hoping Bijan Robinson can contribute a little bit more to the 2023 Falcons in the future than what Michael Turner contributed on the ground game to that 2012 offense. But, those are some of the pros, pretty obvious. But the cons are, dealing with the money and the age, right? The thing that stopped a trade from happening for teams was the contract that teams would have to basically inherit like $20 million in base salary. Now they don't have to do that, but I don't know if Hopkins is eager to accept significantly less than that. There's been various reports from various NFL insiders over the last couple of days since news of Hopkins' release first broke that, basically, there was potentially a deal done between him and there was conversations between the Chiefs and the Cardinals about a trade, but then Odell Beckham signed his 1-year $15 million deal with the Ravens, and that kind of threw a wrench in that, because basically Hopkins is like, I need to get at least $15 million because Odell Beckham's the same age as me and has, had similar issues, or even not more issues, of staying healthy the last couple of years. So if he can get that, I should be able to get that. And so that's throwing a wrench into it. So, if you're a team, we'll see how it all plays out over the course of the next coming days and weeks and months, potentially. But, Hopkins is going to get ponied up, and presumably, if he was going to take a discount, I don't think it would be from the Atlanta Falcons, right? Like maybe for the Bills or the Chiefs, he'd take a discount from that $15 million range, but for the Falcons, I don't think he's taking a discount. So I don't know if the Falcons are necessarily looking to pay that type of price for a quote unquote number 2 wide receiver. And then the age, he turns 31 next week, right? And that makes Hopkins really a short-term option, and he's been dealing with nagging injuries, suspensions the last couple of years, and that's not something that's going to go away as he gets older moving forward. And the other, I think that leads to an issue of high maintenance, and it's not necessarily from a diva personality standpoint, although I've read various people still feel like Hopkins is that guy, but like you're gonna have to keep him on a pitch count, and I don't know if the Falcons are necessarily going to be interested in doing that, especially given that he's probably not the ideal scheme fit at this point in time in his career. Like if you're acquiring DeAndre Hopkins, the expectation is you're going to throw the football. And I don't know if Arthur Smith is about that life, throwing the football as much as you would need to justify the money that you're paying Hopkins and the investment that you put in the guys like London and Pitts, as well as Bijan and whatnot. So as I said in March, the case for Hopkins is like you're trying to maximize the next 2 years of Desmond Ridder, because essentially to me, Hopkins addition for the Falcons is at most a 2-year rental. That was the case when it was trade conversation, and now the case with free agency, because, I don't think you want to be in the DeAndre Hopkins market come 2025, right? When he's going to be 33 years old, because around that time is you're going to be looking to extend Kyle Pitts and Drake London. And you want to pay those guys premium dollars when they're in their primes, rather than, having this albatross of a contract for a 33-year-old DeAndre Hopkins hanging on your neck at that point in time. So I feel like, as I said in March and have said many times, like if the Falcons were to, go out there and acquire a veteran receiver or make a trade for a veteran receiver, They would target younger guys. The names I've continuously mentioned on the podcast: Hunter Renfrow, Tyler Boyd, Van Jefferson. All those guys are between 26 and 28 years old. Theoretically, because they're 3+ years younger than DeAndre Hopkins, you're not just renting them for 2 years, but you're potentially renting them for 4 or 5 or more years, just because of the upside that they potentially possess. And another player that is in that same age range is Corey Davis, and it's notable to me because the Jets are a team that has been mentioned as a team that may pursue DeAndre Hopkins, based off of a report from Jeremy Fowler of ESPN over the weekend. He wrote a blurb on the Jets acquiring or being interested in Hopkins, saying that New York was very close to signing Odell Beckham Jr. before the Ravens came with a compelling offer. The Jets appear open to adding another target for Aaron Rodgers. New York has $6.9 million in cap space, but can create more by reworking the salaries of CJ Mosley, who was making $17 million, and Corey Davis, who's making $10.5 million. A receiver nucleus of Garrett Wilson, Hopkins, Allen Lazard, Mecole Hardman, and Davis would be dangerous. And yes, Jeremy Fowler also mentioned the Falcons as a quote-unquote wild card team to land Hopkins in that same article. In the blurb he wrote about the Falcons, is Atlanta has been unafraid to spend this offseason while enjoying the fruits of a quarterback on a rookie contract. Its pass-catching core is young, but the presence of Hopkins could spice up Arthur Smith's offense. Like Cleveland, Atlanta GM Terry Fontenot has aggressively pursued signings and trades over the past 3 months. So, I don't think a Corey Davis trade for the Falcons is likely, but I will continue to pound the table that I think the Jets and Corey Davis parting ways at some point this offseason is inevitable, right? And we've talked about before how, teams typically do not keep more than 4 active receivers on their roster that don't play special teams, right? And you already have, and theoretically the Jets could say, okay, well, Mecole Hardman, you'll be a special teams guy, so you'll just be a return specialist. And that will leave us with Garrett Wilson, Allen Lazard, Corey Davis, and Randall Cobb as our 4 active receivers on game day. But if they were to sign DeAndre Hopkins, one of those guys is going to have to go. And I pretty much guarantee it's not going to be Garrett Wilson. It's not going to be Allen Lazard. It's not going to be Randall Cobb. So clearly it's going to be Corey Davis. And rather than, restructure, and it's not really a restructure because Corey Davis is in the final year of his contract, it's going to be have to pay cut. Like why would the Jets make Corey Davis take a pay cut so they can keep DeAndre Hopkins? Just cut Corey Davis so that you can replace him with DeAndre Hopkins. And so to me, the Corey Davis situation, I brought this up before, is to me like the reverse of the Deion Jones situation from last year. As you guys recall, this time last year in late May, I sat here on the podcast and said Deion Jones has probably played his last down as an Atlanta Falcon. And, that was true of the regular season, not so true of the preseason. He did play a couple of preseason snaps later that summer. And I basically said at some point, the Falcons going to part ways with him, whether it's a trade, whether it's a cut, he's done in Atlanta. And while I didn't get the timing right, because there was a lot of factors that delayed that departure of Deion Jones here in Atlanta, and ultimately he was traded to the Browns in October, we took a meandering path, but we got to the destination, right? So that wound up being true. And to me, it's the same thing with Corey Davis and the Jets, right? The Jets can sit here and talk all this talk about, oh, we want Corey Davis here on the team, but clearly all the signs are there that the Jets and Corey Davis are eventually going to part ways. It's just a matter of how and when. Is it a trade? Probably not. Is it a release? I think that's probably more likely. And so I think, the Jets are going to drag this out. The Falcons can afford to be patient. It's a waiting game. We'll see whether or not the Jets are willing to roll with Corey Davis going into the season. But the thing I'll say is, even if they are successfully able to get Corey Davis to take a pay cut, regardless of what happens with DeAndre Hopkins and whether he lands in New York, it sounds like a lot of people think Cleveland will also be an option there as well to reunite him with the Browns quarterback. But I think eventually, if the Jets are even successful getting Corey Davis to take a pay cut, guess what that does, guys? It makes him a lot easier to trade to a team like the Atlanta Falcons. So we will continue on this podcast to push the Corey Davis watch, hashtag, whatever you want to call it, here on the podcast. I know some of you guys are going to be tired of it. So for probably the 44th time, the 44th time on the podcast, and probably the 44th of 88 times that we'll say on the podcast, is this the week that the Falcons land Corey Davis? We'll find out right later. Probably not. But, again, I just think this is a waiting game. It's eventually going to happen. Corey Davis, good veteran presence, by all accounts, a great locker room guy. fits the scheme. He's got size, he can block. Arthur Smith knows how to utilize him. It just, and again, because he's 28, you're not necessarily going to be renting him for a year or two. Potentially, him and Drake London could be a tag team duo here in Atlanta should Corey Davis find his way south to Atlanta, for many, many years to come. So it, to me, makes total sense, but we'll just have to, play the waiting game. We'll just be patient, and Jets are going to keep, pretending that they're going to keep Corey Davis here. And I'll continue to die on this hill that they are not going to do it. And eventually Corey Davis will find his way to Atlanta. And even if we're sitting here on Halloween on the trade deadline and it hasn't happened, I'm still going to, he's going to be a free agent next year. And I'm going to still sit here and go, when we get to January, is this the offseason where the Falcons acquire Corey Davis? So we'll see how that goes, guys. But we'll wrap up today's episode talking with Andrew Lyon of Locked On Gamecocks to talk about the Falcons' final draft pick in Jovaughn Gwyn. And I believe for all you everydayers, is shout out to you guys that make this podcast your first listen, that have heard all this stuff about Corey Davis and DeAndre Hopkins many times before. I think tomorrow, as your first listen, we'll continue talking about the wide receivers, because I want to talk a little bit about potential post June 1 moves, and that will allow me to, revisit Hunter Renfrow as a potential option, because I do think once June 1st hits, the Raiders, it becomes a lot easier for the Raiders to move on for Hunter Renfrow. So that seems like a trade that's much more likely. And so we'll revisit that topic in addition to, keeping Corey Davis on the back burner. Right. So that will be worthwhile discussion, as well as I have some thoughts on, the Falcons solving their swing tackle needs. So we'll talk about some potential summer moves at the Falcon that we can look forward to the Falcons after June 1st on tomorrow's episode, but we'll get into that then. Today, we will continue the conversation with Andrew Lyon of the Locked On Gamecocks. All right, everyone, you are back with another illustrious guest here on Locked On Falcons. He is none other than Andrew Lyon. Andrew Lyon. I'm sorry, Andrew.
It's okay.
I literally just asked you how to say your name and I just messed it up. Andrew Lyon, host of Locked On Gamecocks. You can check him out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as the lead writer for Gamecocks Digest over at si.com. Despite botching this intro, Andrew, welcome to Locked On Falcons.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate you having me on. This is my first time on an NFL-based podcast, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I know there's exciting times going on in South Carolina for, this Shane Beamer era that's gotten off to a great start. And, with that program looking to be on the up, I'm curious to see how it kind of coincided with Jovaughn Gwyn's career in Columbia. He seems to, from everything I've read about him and from what little I've watched of him, he seems to check all the boxes from like a leadership, a character, a durability standpoint. He was a two-time captain, 47 consecutive starts at the right guard position, a semifinalist for the William Campbell Trophy, which is the academic Heisman. It seems like there's everything to love about him as a prospect, but it just seemed like NFL teams looked at him even though he's a large human being for most of us that are walking the planet, he's not that big relative to most of the offensive linemen in the NFL. And I'm just curious, do you feel like the only reason why he didn't go higher in the draft was because of those size concerns?
I absolutely agree with you on that, Aaron. I think that size concerns is the reason why Jovaughn Gwyn was picked in the 7th round of the NFL draft. Obviously, when you're a guy that's about 6'2", 297 pounds, and someone that's got a wingspan of, I believe, 77 inches, which according to NFLDraftBuzz.com is in the 7th percentile for offensive linemen, on the very near bottom of the barrel. When it comes to the NFL, that stuff is going to hurt you. Obviously, in terms of just overall mass, people are going to expect that maybe your strength might not be able to match up with everybody on the defensive line, and obviously wingspan. If there's one measurable that you want offensive linemen to have in the NFL where it's like right up there at the top, it is wingspan, because it gives you a little bit more of a chance to win your one-on-ones, especially in pass protection. So Jovaughn Gwyn, it is going to be an uphill battle for him in that perspective. But in terms of all the other intangibles that you mentioned, he aces every single other aspect. I mean, he's a very smart player. Again, you mentioned semifinals for the academic Heisman this past fall, a 2-time team captain. He's a guy that's going to come into the building every single day. Probably one of those guys that's going to be one of the first one in, last one out type of players. And he's somebody that is going to fight and try to earn what it is he's going to be offered by the Falcons. He's not going to expect it to be handed to him, obviously, especially considering the fact he was one of the last draft picks in the draft back in April. So Jovaughn Gwyn is somebody that I think fans are going to be pulling for in Atlanta. I think you're going to want to see this guy succeed. And I think that Gwyn is somebody that can offer some potential. I think that his main strength lies in terms of run blocking, relevant to pass blocking, but obviously him playing guard, he might be able to get more help in the NFL with, obviously his fellow lineman mates on the offensive side of the ball. But yeah, I think Jovaughn Gwyn, again, in terms of size concerns, that's why you probably saw him fall to the 7th round in the NFL draft.
Well, you talk about his run blocking versus his pass blocking, and obviously I don't watch South Carolina nearly as much as you do, but I can recall a couple of years ago when like Kevin Harris was going real strong. They had a really strong running game, and I went back earlier and watched some of those Kevin Harris highlights because I liked him as a prospect a couple of years ago, and like all over the highlights you just see like Jovaughn Gwyn pulling and clearing all these run lanes, despite the fact that again, you wouldn't necessarily say that about a guy given his size, but like the agility, the athleticism to get him on the move and all these various things. And then the last couple of years, we've seen kind of South Carolina kind of abandon the run game that was so strong at the end of the Will Muschamp era to sort of embrace this sort of pass first offense, especially this past year with Spencer Rattler in the building. I'm curious, is that a fair assessment to say that South Carolina's identity has kind of shifted over the course of Gwyn's career? And how do you think Gwyn handled that sort of transition?
Aaron, I think it's totally fair. In 2020, South Carolina had Mike Bobo as their offensive coordinator, which I'm sure many Atlanta fans now will remember as, Georgia's new offensive coordinator as of this offseason. So the Gamecocks had a very power run heavy blocking scheme for their offense. And that is where Jovaughn Gwyn, in my opinion, is going to thrive. He's going to thrive more so in those one-on-ones where, he knows where he needs to get to. He knows probably the defender he needs to look for. And again, he might not exactly have the size measurables that you want, but he's a guy that is going to be technically sound. He's going to have good hand placement. He's going to be able to run his feet well. And if you're an offensive lineman that has good hands and good feet, then you're going to give yourself a good chance on every single play to win your one-on-one, whether it's pass blocking or run blocking. And then the past couple years, South Carolina has sort of moved more towards a zone blocking scheme, which I still think because of his smarts is something that Jovaughn Gwyn can do well in. But I do feel like that Gwyn is somebody that you want to give him a full head of steam. You want to have him pulling and doing trap blocks on the offensive line. I think that's where he really excels at the most. And again, that's not to say that he had a massive drop off in terms of production, but I think it is fair to say that South Carolina's offensive coordinator for the past couple years, who's now at Nebraska, Marcus Satterfield, I don't think his scheme was all that friendly to the personnel that South Carolina had on their offensive line. And I think if Atlanta, with assuming that they run both zone and power blocking schemes, if they can figure out a way to incorporate Jovaughn Gwyn in more power run blocking schemes whenever he does get his chance on the field throughout this offseason, going to preseason camp, then I think that Gwyn's going to have a chance to really show the coaches what he can do in terms of his full potential. But if he doesn't get that chance, then, he might be really having to fight hard to make that 53-man roster later in August.
Yeah, I think it will be an uphill battle for Jovaughn Gwyn. The Falcons do play a lot of zone stuff, but I think he has a champion in on that coaching staff because Dwayne Ledford, who is the Falcons offensive line coach, used to be the offensive line coach at NC State. And from what I've read, NC State was one of the teams that heavily recruited Jovaughn Gwyn. And I think Dwayne Ledford was like, I like this guy. And then, now like 5 years later, it's like, I got a chance to actually coach this guy, which I wanted to do 5 years ago. So I think he'll have a champion on that coaching staff, and we'll see what Jovaughn Gwyn can do. I think, the Falcons are going to probably try to transition him long-term to the center position where they think, he may, those size concerns may not be as pressing an issue because you won't have to put him one-on-one in pass protection as much. And we'll sort of see how that transition goes. But, I think he's kind of a little bit of a project that the Falcons may stash, whether that's on the practice squad or the back end of the roster this upcoming season. But I do think there's a lot to like about Jovaughn Gwyn and what he can be in the future here in Atlanta. But for those people that are curious of what's going on in Columbia, tell the listeners and the viewers where they can check out your stuff, Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're interested in looking for more content regarding South Carolina Gamecock athletics, you can go and find me at Locked On Gamecocks on YouTube, and you can also search it up wherever you get your audio podcasts. And you can also give us a follow at Twitter. My personal @ is @ALion_SC. We've also got @LockedOnSC specifically for the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. And then, as Aaron mentioned at the beginning, which I do appreciate, you can also find my written work on South Carolina over on Gamecocks Digest at si.com.
Andrew, I really appreciate you joining me on today's Locked On Falcons. Look forward to seeing, what, a different brand of Beamer ball can get up to, one state up from Georgia, so curious to see how, the Gamecocks, make this, if they can maybe close the distance between a certain team in the state of Georgia in that SEC East in the years to come. But certainly looking forward to seeing what you do on Locked On Gamecocks, as well as what Jovaughn Gwyn can do here in Atlanta. So I appreciate you coming on today's Locked On Falcons.
Thank you, Aaron. All
right, guys, that's it on today's episode. As I said earlier, we will be talking about potential post-June / summer moves, including, discussing, does it make sense for the Falcons to acquire someone like Hunter Renfrow as opposed to, waiting for Corey Davis? They just don't have the patience to wait for the Jets to, do the thing or get off the pot, as they say, or, passing on DeAndre Hopkins. Does Hunter Renfrow make sense? As well as I have a theory on we're going to be looking at another team that plays in the same division as the Jets, the Miami Dolphins, as a potential option that may help the Falcons solve their offensive tackle depth needs later this summer. So that will be something to keep an eye on for tomorrow's episode here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, and continue to make us your first listen. All right, guys, appreciate it. Till then.